Welcome to Truth Behind History, where one of the most extraordinary survival stories in all of human civilization begins. Imagine a people whose origins reach deep into the ancient world, whose sacred traditions outlived empires, whose homeland was conquered, whose temple was destroyed, whose communities were scattered across continents, and yet whose identity never disappeared. That is the story we are stepping into today. This is not just the history of a religion, and it is not just the history of a land. It is the history of memory, covenant, exile, endurance, and return. It is a story that sits at the crossroads of faith, politics, archaeology, empire, and identity, which is exactly why it has fascinated believers, historians, skeptics, and statesmen for so long. In this video, we are going to trace that long arc across roughly 3,000 years, from the ancient roots of the Jewish people to the rise of the modern state of Israel, and along the way we are going to treat the subject with the seriousness it deserves. That means looking not only at the familiar milestones, but also at the tensions, the debates, and the questions that still make this history so contested. By the end, you should have a much clearer understanding of how Judaism developed, how the Jewish people endured through conquest and displacement, and why the history of Israel remains one of the most powerful and controversial stories in the modern world. On this slide, we need to start with a simple question. Why does this history matter so much? After all, the ancient world is full of vanished kingdoms, forgotten tribes, and religions that rose and fell with the empires around them. So why does the story of Judaism and Israel still command so much attention? The answer is that this is not a history locked safely in the past. It still shapes the present in profound ways. Judaism is one of the oldest surviving religious traditions in the world, and its ideas have influenced not only Jewish civilization but also Christianity and Islam, which means its legacy reaches billions of people. At the same time, the history of the Jewish people is not only spiritual, it is also deeply tied to questions of ancestry, memory, homeland, and survival. Then, laid on top of that ancient identity, you have the modern state of Israel, which sits at the center of some of the most debated political and moral arguments of our time. That means when people talk about this history, they are often talking about far more than old events. They are talking about belonging, legitimacy, trauma, land, and the meaning of continuity itself. And that is part of what makes this topic so powerful and so difficult. For some, it is sacred history. For others, it is national history. For others still, it is a case study in empire, displacement, and modern conflict. So before we go any further, it is important to understand that this is not just a story about what happened long ago. It is a story that still lives in prayers, in borders, in arguments, in family memory, and in global politics. That is why it matters. One of the first things that makes this history hard to understand is that Judaism does not fit neatly into the categories people often expect. If someone says Christianity, most people think first of a religion. If someone says French or Japanese, most people think first of a nation or an ethnicity. But Judaism has elements of all of these at once, and that is where many modern misunderstandings begin. Judaism is certainly a religion, with its own beliefs, laws, rituals, sacred texts, and traditions. But Jewish identity has also long functioned as a shared peoplehood, something passed through family lines, collective memory, customs, language traditions, and a common historical story. In other words, being Jewish has often meant more than simply adhering to a set of theological ideas. It has also meant being part of a historical community that sees itself as connected across time. And then there is the national dimension, because throughout Jewish history there has also been a strong connection to land, especially the land associated with ancient Israel and Jerusalem. So when we talk about Jewish history, we are not talking only about worship practices or religious doctrine. We are talking about a people who preserved a sense of identity across generations, even when they lived under foreign rule, even when they were dispersed across many countries, and even when they spoke different languages and adapted to different surrounding cultures. That layered identity helps explain why Jewish history can be discussed in religious terms, cultural terms, ethnic terms, and national terms, sometimes all at the same time. It also helps explain why modern debates around Judaism and Israel become so emotionally charged so quickly, because the subject touches not just belief, but ancestry, memory, survival, and belonging. When many people think about the beginning of Jewish history, the name that usually comes first is Abraham. In the Hebrew Bible, Abraham is presented as the founding patriarch, the man called by God to leave his homeland and journey toward the land of Canaan. More importantly, his story is tied to the idea of covenant, a binding relationship between God and his descendants that becomes one of the central themes of Jewish tradition. That covenant is not just a religious detail, It helps shape the entire way the Jewish people understand themselves in the biblical narrative, as a people bound not only by ancestry, but also by a shared calling, law, and destiny. Now, historically speaking, this is where things become more complicated. Abraham is enormously important in religious memory, but outside the biblical tradition, direct historical evidence for him as an individual figure is not something scholars can point to with confidence. That does not mean the story has no historical value. It means that historians and archaeologists tend to approach it carefully. Some see these early patriarchal stories as sacred tradition rather than verifiable biography. Others suggest they may preserve distant cultural memories of migrations, kinship networks, and the movements of Semitic peoples in the ancient Near East. So the story of Abraham matters on more than one level. For believers, it is the beginning of a covenantal people. For historians, it is part of a foundational tradition that shaped identity, memory, and continuity over centuries. And that distinction is important because from the very beginning of this history, faith and historical reconstruction do not always operate in exactly the same way. If Abraham represents the remember beginning, the next question is this: who were the early Israelites in historical terms? Were they outsiders who entered Canaan from somewhere else, just as the biblical narrative seems to suggest in broad form, or did they emerge more gradually from within the land itself? This is one of the major debates in ancient Near Eastern history, and it matters because it shapes how we understand the birth of Israelite identity. Older readings often imagined a sharp break, with a distinct people arriving and establishing themselves in the land. But many modern historians and archaeologists see a more gradual process. In that view, the early Israelites may have emerged largely from within the broader Canaanite world, slowly developing a distinct identity over time rather than appearing all at once as a completely separate civilization. That would mean early Israelite culture was not born in a vacuum. It would have shared language patterns, material culture, and social structures with neighboring peoples, especially in its earliest stages. What then made the Israelites different was not necessarily instant separation, but the gradual formation of a new religious and communal identity. This is where ideas like covenant, tribal affiliation, and a developing form of devotion to one God begin to matter more and more. And even here, we should be careful. Early Israelite religion may not have looked exactly like later Judaism. The fully developed monotheism most people associate with Judaism took shape over time. So this slide is really about emergence. It is about the possibility that the Israelites began not as a fully formed people dropping onto the stage of history, but as communities slowly becoming something new, something distinct, and something that would eventually give rise to one of the most enduring identities in human history. Now we arrive at the traditional rise of the Kingdom of Israel, the part of the story associated with three famous names: Saul, David, and Solomon. In the biblical account, Saul is remembered as the first king, a figure tied to the early unification of the Israelite tribes. David then becomes the great royal founder, the warrior king who establishes Jerusalem as the political center. Solomon, David's son, is remembered as the wise ruler who consolidates the kingdom and oversees a period of wealth, order, and monumental building. Together, these three figures form the classic image of early Israelite kingship. But once again, history and tradition do not always line up neatly. There is little doubt that these figures loom large in Jewish memory and in the larger biblical story, yet historians still debate how powerful and centralized this early kingdom really was. Was it a major regional state with broad influence, or was it a smaller and more modest highland kingdom that later tradition remembered in grander terms? David in particular sits at the center of that debate. Some scholars see evidence that supports the existence of a Davidic dynasty, while others remain cautious about how extensive his actual realm may have been. So what matters here is not only the question of what happened, but also the kind of political imagination this kingdom represented. The idea of kingship gave the Israelites a stronger sense of unity, a more defined center, and eventually a royal capital in Jerusalem. In other words, even where the scale is debated, the significance is not. This is the stage where Israel begins to appear not just as a loose collection of tribes, but as a kingdom with rulers, institutions, and a growing sense of national identity. The first temple stands at the heart of early Jewish memory because it was far more than just an impressive building. In the biblical tradition, it was built in Jerusalem under Solomon and became the central place of worship for the God of Israel. That matters because before this point, Israelite religion was less geographically fixed. But with the temple, worship gained a clear center, and Jerusalem began to take on a unique spiritual and political importance that would echo through everything that came later. The temple symbolized permanence, order, and divine presence. It was where sacrifices were offered, where major religious life was concentrated, and where the connection between kingship, priesthood, and covenant became physically embodied in stone, ritual, and sacred space. In that sense, the temple was not just a religious site. It was a statement about identity. It said that this people had a center, a sacred focus, and a place where heaven and history were believed to meet. Historians, of course, debate aspects of the early monarchy and the exact scale of Solomon's kingdom, but whatever the archaeology can or cannot confirm in full, the importance of the temple in Jewish historical consciousness is undeniable. It became the anchor of worship, the symbol of unity, and the beating heart of Jerusalem's sacred status. And that helps explain why later destructions of the temple would not be remembered as ordinary military defeats, but as civilization-shaking catastrophes. The United Kingdom did not remain united for long. After the era associated with David and Solomon, the biblical tradition describes a political split that produced two separate kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. This division is one of the most important developments in early Jewish history because it turned a single royal story into a fractured one. The northern kingdom of Israel was generally larger and, in many ways, more economically significant, while Judah in the south was smaller and centered on Jerusalem. On paper, that might sound like a normal political breakup, the kind of thing that happens all the time in history when rival elites, regional loyalties, and succession tensions pull a state apart. But here the consequences were much bigger than that. Once the kingdom split, the Israelites were no longer facing the world as one political unit. They became more vulnerable, more regionally divided, and more exposed to the ambitions of surrounding empires. The split also deepened differences in religious and political identity, because Jerusalem remained the center of Judah, while the northern kingdom developed its own centers of power and worship. So this was not just a border change. It was the beginning of a long pattern in which internal fragmentation made outside conquest easier. And that is a theme that appears again and again in history, not just here. A people may share ancestry, memory, and tradition, but when political unity breaks down, the costs can be enormous. The first of the two kingdoms to fall was the northern kingdom of Israel, and it fell to one of the most powerful empires of the ancient world, Assyria. In the year 722 before Christ, the Assyrians conquered the north, shattered its political structure, and absorbed it into their imperial system. This was not just a military defeat. It was the collapse of an entire kingdom. Assyria was known for ruling through force, deportation, and administrative control, and one of the most famous ideas tied to this conquest is the notion of the lost tribes of Israel. According to later tradition, many people from the northern kingdom were dispersed, absorbed, or otherwise faded from clear historical view, giving rise to the enduring mystery of the 10 lost tribes. Now, historians debate how literal or complete that disappearance really was. In reality, populations in the ancient world were rarely erased in one clean motion. Some were deported, some remained, some intermarried, and some likely carried elements of their identity forward in ways that became harder to trace. But from the standpoint of memory, the meaning was clear. The northern kingdom was gone. Its fall became an early warning about what could happen when a smaller state stood in the path of a vast imperial machine. It also meant that from this point forward, Judah in the south would carry the main surviving political and religious legacy of ancient Israel, with Jerusalem becoming even more central as the northern story receded into conquest, exile, and historical uncertainty. If the fall of the northern kingdom was a warning, the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem was a civilizational rupture. In the year 586 before Christ, the Babylonians captured Jerusalem, destroyed the city, and brought down the first temple, the very place that had stood at the center of Jewish worship and identity. It is difficult to overstate how traumatic this would have been. A kingdom can survive defeat for a time, but when its capital is burned, its ruling structure broken, and its sacred center destroyed, the shock runs far deeper than politics. This was not just the loss of territory. It was the collapse of the visible world that had anchored religious life, royal legitimacy, and national memory. Many members of the elite, especially political, priestly, and educated classes, were taken into exile in Babylon. That exile mattered enormously because it forced a profound question: how does a people remain itself when it has lost its land, its king, and its temple? For many ancient societies, a disaster like this might have meant dissolution. But in Jewish history, it became the beginning of a transformation. The Babylonian conquest exposed the vulnerability of small kingdoms caught between larger powers, but it also set the stage for something remarkable. The destruction was real, the suffering was real, and the sense of judgment and dislocation was real, yet this was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new phase in which survival would depend less on political independence and more on memory, law, faith, and communal endurance. One of the most important things to understand about the Babylonian exile is that Judaism did not simply continue unchanged after the destruction of Jerusalem. It began to transform. Before the exile, religious life had been tied closely to land, kingship, and above all the temple in Jerusalem. But once the temple was gone and many of the people were living far from their homeland, that old structure could no longer function in the same way. So the question became urgent. If worship cannot revolve around the temple, and if the people are no longer gathered in their own land, what now holds them together? The answer, over time, was a deeper emphasis on scripture, law, memory, and communal practice. In exile, identity had to become more portable. It had to travel with the people. That meant sacred tradition was no longer only something anchored to one city or one building. It was increasingly carried through texts, teaching, ritual, and shared obedience to religious law. This did not happen all at once, and historians debate the exact pace and shape of the transition, but the larger direction is clear. Exile pushed Jewish life toward forms that could survive displacement. In a strange and profound way, catastrophe forced adaptation. What had once depended heavily on a central sanctuary now began developing into a tradition that could endure across distance and time. That shift is one of the great turning points in Jewish history because it helps explain how a people could lose a kingdom and still preserve a civilization. After the Babylonian conquest came a major political change because Babylon itself was overtaken by the Persian Empire. Under Persian rule, especially under Cyrus the Great, a new approach emerged. Instead of simply crushing conquered peoples and keeping them permanently uprooted, the Persians often governed with a degree of flexibility, allowing local traditions and religious life to continue under imperial oversight. For the Jews in exile, this opened the door to return. Cyrus is remembered in Jewish tradition as the ruler who allowed many Jews to go back to Jerusalem and begin rebuilding their communal life. That decision was enormously significant, not only politically but spiritually. It meant that exile was no longer the only reality. Return became possible. Now, it is important to remember that return did not mean everything was suddenly restored to its former glory. The Old Kingdom was not simply revived as if nothing had happened. Judah remained under imperial power, and the returning community faced real hardships, including economic weakness, political dependence, and the challenge of rebuilding after devastation. Still, Persian policy created the conditions for renewal. In practical terms, this is a reminder that empires do not all govern the same way. Some destroy and scatter. Others preserve local elites and traditions when it serves their interests. The Persians were not acting out of modern humanitarian ideals. They were running an empire. But in doing so, they made possible one of the most important recoveries in Jewish history, the re-establishment of Jewish life in Jerusalem after exile. The rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem marked a turning point, because it gave the returning Jewish community more than a construction project. It gave them a center again. This was the Second Temple, built after the exile under Persian rule, and while it did not erase the memory of what had been lost, it represented restoration, continuity, and survival. The people had not regained the old glory of an independent kingdom, but they had regained a sacred focal point. That matters because religion is not only made of beliefs floating in the abstract, it is also shaped by place, ritual, and shared public life. The temple restored a visible center for worship, sacrifice, and communal identity. Jerusalem once again became the spiritual heart of Jewish life, even though the political realities were very different from the days associated with David or Solomon. This is also the period when Jewish identity became more sharply defined around law, priestly practice, and communal boundaries. In other words, the rebuilt temple was not simply a copy of the old order. It stood in a changed world, among a people who had been humbled by conquest and reshaped by exile. So the Second Temple period begins with both continuity and change. The sacred center returns, but the community that gathers around it has learned that survival cannot depend on power alone. It must also depend on memory, discipline, and a form of identity strong enough to endure even under foreign rule. Then the map changes again, and it changes dramatically, because the region falls under the influence of Alexander the Great. When Alexander swept out of Macedon and conquered the Persian Empire, he did not just replace one ruling power with another. He helped spread Greek language, culture, ideas, and political habits across a huge stretch of the ancient world, including the lands connected to Jewish history. This process is often called Hellenization, and it meant that Jewish communities now found themselves living in a world shaped more and more by Greek influence. That influence could be seen in education, philosophy, government, language, city life, and even the way elites presented themselves. In many parts of the ancient Near East, Greek culture came to be associated with sophistication, prestige, and power. And that created both opportunities and tensions. On one hand, Jewish life was now connected to a wider Mediterranean world, one that was intellectually vibrant and deeply interconnected. On the other hand, foreign cultural influence always raises a difficult question for smaller or tradition-bound communities. How much can you absorb before you stop being yourself? That question does not explode fully on this slide yet, but Alexander's conquest is what sets it up. His arrival marks the beginning of a new era in which Jewish history unfolds not only under imperial rule, but under the pressure of a culture that was expansive, confident, and often very persuasive. Once Greek influence spread across the region, the real tension was not simply political control. It was cultural pressure. Greek culture was powerful, prestigious, and attractive in many ways. It offered language, philosophy, education, urban life, athletic ideals, and a broader connection to the Mediterranean world. For some Jews, especially those drawn into elite society, that influence could seem useful or even exciting. But for others, it raised a dangerous question. If the surrounding culture becomes the standard for success, status, and public life, what happens to distinct Jewish tradition? That is the heart of this slide. The conflict was not necessarily between people who loved progress and people who hated it. It was often a conflict over boundaries, identity, and survival. How much outside influence can a community absorb before it starts to lose the very practices that make it unique? In the Jewish case, this could touch everything from language and education to religious customs and public loyalty. And because religion in the ancient world was tied so closely to communal life, cultural pressure did not feel neutral. It could feel like a direct threat to covenant, law, and faithfulness. This is why cultural conflict can be just as destabilizing as military conquest. Armies can take your land, but prestige and imitation can slowly reshape your values from within. For Jewish communities under Greek influence, that tension between adaptation and preservation became one of the defining struggles of the age. That tension finally erupted into open revolt in the story of the Maccabees, one of the most dramatic turning points in Jewish history. The Maccabean Revolt began as a Jewish uprising against the Seleucid rulers, a Greek dynasty that controlled the region after the breakup of Alexander's empire. The conflict was not only about who held power, it was also about how far foreign rule could interfere with Jewish religious life. When outside authority begins pressing into sacred practice, identity stops being an abstract issue very quickly. It becomes a line people are willing to fight over. The revolt is remembered as a struggle to defend Jewish worship, law, and tradition against forced cultural and religious pressure. And that is part of why it left such a deep mark on Jewish memory. This was not merely resistance to taxes or administration. It was resistance to the feeling that a people's covenantal life was being pushed aside in favor of imperial conformity. The Maccabees, led by a priestly family, became symbols of defiance, and their success eventually made possible a period of renewed Jewish self-rule. That outcome mattered enormously, because it showed that Jewish political independence, however temporary, could be regained even after generations of living under foreign empires. The revolt is also tied to the origins of Hanukkah, the Jewish festival that commemorates the rededication of the temple. So this moment carries both political and religious meaning. It is about resistance, restoration, and the refusal to let a dominant outside culture define the limits of Jewish life. After the Maccabean period, Jewish independence did not last forever, and eventually Judea came under the control of a new imperial power that would shape its fate in enormous ways, Rome. Roman rule changed the political world of Judea by pulling it into one of the most powerful and organized empires in history. And Rome did not rule like a distant shadow. It ruled through governors, client kings, taxation, military presence, and a bureaucratic system designed to keep order and extract stability from valuable regions. For Judea, this created a deeply tense situation. The Jewish people still had a strong religious identity, a sacred center in Jerusalem, and a memory of covenant and self-rule, but now they lived under an empire that expected obedience, revenue, and calm above all else. That is often where the friction begins in history. A centralized imperial system wants predictability. A people with a powerful religious and national memory wants dignity, autonomy, and faithfulness to its own traditions. Those things can coexist for a while, but they are never fully comfortable together. Roman control also intensified internal divisions within Jewish society, because different groups responded to empire in different ways. Some were more willing to cooperate, others were more resistant. Some tried to preserve religious life under the system. Others saw foreign domination itself as intolerable. So when Rome takes control of Judea, this is not just a change of rulers on a map. It is the start of a political pressure cooker, where empire, taxation, military authority, and sacred identity are all forced into the same space. By the time open revolt broke out against Rome, the pressures inside Judea had been building for years. This was not the kind of rebellion that appears out of nowhere. It grew from a volatile mix of political resentment, religious tension, social unrest, and the daily humiliation of living under foreign rule. Rome expected order, taxes, and submission, but for many Jews, especially those who saw their identity as inseparable from covenant and sacred law, imperial control was not just inconvenient. It was offensive. Add to that corrupt local leadership, factional conflict, and the presence of Roman power in a land centered on Jerusalem, and you have the ingredients for explosion. The Jewish Revolt, which began in the year 66 after Christ, was in part a response to that pressure. But it was also shaped by a deeper problem that often appears in resistance movements. Different people may agree that the current system is intolerable, yet still disagree on what should be done, how far to go, and what victory would even look like. Some hoped to throw off Roman rule. Others likely underestimated the scale of the response Rome would bring. That is one of the tragic realities of history. Small nations or subject peoples sometimes rebel because the alternative feels unbearable, even when the odds are terrible. And Rome did not respond with hesitation. It responded as empires usually do when they believe authority is being challenged in a strategic region, with overwhelming force. So this revolt was not only a bid for freedom, it was also the beginning of a catastrophic confrontation between a people fighting for religious and political dignity and an empire determined to prove that rebellion would carry an unbearable cost. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in the year 70 after Christ, they did more than crush a revolt. They shattered the central institution of Jewish life. The city was devastated, and the Second Temple, the sacred heart of Jewish worship, was destroyed. This was one of the defining catastrophes in all of Jewish history. To understand why, we have to remember what the temple meant. It was not just a religious building among many others. It was the center of sacrifice, pilgrimage, priestly ritual, and sacred identity. It was the place where national memory, covenant, and worship converged. So when it fell, something far deeper than a military position was lost. A whole structure of life was broken, and Rome made sure the lesson would be unmistakable. Empires often destroy more than armies when they put down rebellion. They destroy symbols. They target the institutions that give a people its confidence, cohesion, and sense of sacred meaning. That is exactly what happened here. The destruction of Jerusalem was both a military act and a political message. But while Rome succeeded in crushing the city, it did not erase the people. In fact, this disaster would force one of the most important transformations in Jewish history. If the temple was gone, then Jewish life would have to survive without the very institution that had anchored it for centuries. That made this moment both an ending and a beginning. It was the end of the Second Temple world, and the start of a new era in which Jewish continuity would depend not on a standing sanctuary in Jerusalem, but on something that could survive ruin, exile, and time itself. Once the temple was gone, Judaism faced a question that would have seemed almost impossible in earlier centuries. How do you remain the same people, serving the same God, when the central place of worship has been destroyed? That is the challenge behind this slide. The destruction of the Second Temple did not just remove a building. It removed the center of the old religious system, especially the sacrificial practices tied directly to Jerusalem. So Jewish life had to adapt, and that adaptation is one of the great reasons Judaism endured. What emerged more fully in this period was a form of Judaism centered less on sacrifice at a single sanctuary and more on study, prayer, teaching, law, and community life. This is what people usually mean when they talk about rabbinic Judaism. Authority began to rest more heavily with teachers and interpreters of the law rather than with temple priests alone. In practical terms, that meant Jewish life became more portable once again. It could be organized in communities beyond Jerusalem. It could be sustained through shared texts, debate, ritual practice, and disciplined memory. And that portability was not a small detail. It was the key to survival. A tradition tied only to one building can be shattered when that building falls. A tradition carried in learning, practice, and communal life can endure across generations and across continents. So this moment is not just about loss, though there was enormous loss. It is also about resilience through transformation. Judaism without a temple was not Judaism without structure. It was Judaism learning how to live in history after catastrophe. After the destruction of Jerusalem and the loss of the temple, Jewish life did not end in the land of Israel, but it also did not remain confined there. Over time, Jewish communities spread more widely across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, forming what we call the diaspora. That word simply refers to dispersion, but the historical reality behind it is much bigger than the term itself might suggest. The diaspora was not one single event where everyone suddenly left at once. It was a long process shaped by conquest, trade, migration, exile, opportunity, and survival. Some Jewish communities had already existed outside the land long before the Romans destroyed the temple. Others grew later as people moved, resettled, or adapted to changing political conditions. What matters is that Jewish identity proved capable of surviving across distance. This is remarkable when you stop and think about it. Many ancient peoples disappeared into the larger populations around them once their political centers collapsed. The Jews did not. Instead, Jewish communities developed in many different regions while still maintaining core religious traditions, shared memory, and a sense of connection to one another and to Jerusalem. Of course, diaspora life also meant change. Jews in different places spoke different languages, adopted local customs to varying degrees, and lived under very different political systems. So the diaspora was not a story of frozen sameness. It was a story of continuity through adaptation. That balance between preserving identity and adjusting to surrounding societies would become one of the defining patterns of Jewish history for centuries to come. Jewish life in medieval Europe was often marked by a strange combination of persistence, usefulness, vulnerability, and exclusion. Jewish communities managed to survive and even build rich intellectual, religious, and commercial traditions, but they did so in societies that frequently treated them as outsiders. In many parts of Europe, Jews lived as tolerated minorities rather than fully integrated members of the larger Christian world. That meant their position could be stable for a time, but rarely secure in any deep sense. They often faced legal restrictions on where they could live, what land they could own, what professions they could enter, and how openly they could participate in public life. At the same time, rulers sometimes found Jewish communities economically useful, especially in trade, finance, and other areas where Christian restrictions or social structures created gaps. That produced a difficult dynamic. Jewish communities could become necessary enough to be protected in one period, yet still remain separate enough to be blamed in another. And that kind of arrangement is never truly safe. It creates a society where a minority may be relied on without being fully accepted. Jewish life in medieval Europe was not only hardship, though. It also produced scholarship, legal traditions, commentary, communal institutions, and a deepening religious culture that would shape Jewish history for centuries. So this slide is important because it shows both sides of the reality. Medieval European Jews were not passive victims drifting through history. They built real communities and preserved a powerful intellectual and spiritual life. But they did so under conditions that were often precarious, where tolerance could quickly give way to hostility and where being useful never guaranteed being secure. As medieval Europe developed, Jewish communities repeatedly faced one of the harshest realities of minority life under unstable political and religious conditions: expulsion. Entire communities could be forced out of kingdoms where they had lived for generations, not because they had suddenly changed, but because rulers, church pressures, economic tensions, or political convenience made them vulnerable. That is what makes these expulsions so important. They were not isolated accidents. They became a recurring pattern. Jews were expelled from places like England, France, and later Spain, and each expulsion revealed something about the societies doing the expelling. Sometimes Jews were resented because of debt relationships or their role in certain economic functions. Sometimes religious hostility made them easy targets. Sometimes rulers found it useful to seize property, cancel obligations, or redirect public anger toward a visible minority. In other words, expulsions often happened where fear, power, money, and ideology all met. And that combination can be extremely dangerous. What is striking is how fragile acceptance turned out to be. A community might live in a kingdom for decades or even centuries, contribute to its economy, build schools, preserve traditions, and raise families, only to find that all of it could be swept aside by decree. This teaches us something broader about history. When a group's status depends mainly on the convenience of those in power, rather than on secure rights and equal standing, its future is always uncertain. For Jewish communities, expulsion became one of the recurring traumas of diaspora life. Yet even here, survival continued. Communities were uprooted, but they were not erased. They carried memory, law, ritual, and identity with them, rebuilding again and again in new lands. The Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion from Spain stand as one of the most famous and traumatic chapters in the history of the Jewish diaspora. By the late 15th century, Spain had become a place where religious unity was increasingly tied to political power, and that combination can be very dangerous. When states begin to treat religious conformity as a tool of centralized control, minorities often pay the price first. In 1492, the same year that Spain completed the Reconquista and projected a new image of royal strength, the monarchy ordered the expulsion of practicing Jews unless they converted to Christianity. That decision did not come out of nowhere. It grew from a climate of suspicion, pressure, and the belief that unity required sameness. Some Jews left, some converted, whether sincerely or under pressure. Some of those converts, often called conversos, then faced further suspicion anyway, because once a system trains itself to look for hidden disloyalty, conversion does not always end the distrust. The result was not just the loss of homes. It was the scattering of an entire branch of Jewish civilization. Sephardic Jews, whose communities had flourished in Spain for centuries, spread outward into North Africa, the Ottoman world, and other regions, carrying their traditions, language patterns, scholarship, and memory with. So this slide is not only about persecution, it is also about transmission. Spain tried to create a more uniform religious order, but in doing so it helped disperse Sephardic Jewish culture across a far wider world. Once again, the pattern appears. Expulsion uproots a people, but it can also spread that people's traditions into new places where survival continues in altered form. Jewish life in the Islamic world is often left out of simplified versions of history, but it is essential if we want a fuller picture. For long stretches of time, major Jewish communities lived under Muslim rule across places like the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Spain, and their experience was more complex than a simple story of either perfect tolerance or constant oppression. There were periods in which Jewish communities found real space to live, work, study, and contribute to wider society. In some Islamic centers, Jewish scholarship, philosophy, commerce, and religious life flourished in ways that became historically significant. This matters because it reminds us that diaspora history did not unfold in only one civilizational setting. Jewish life developed not just in Christian Europe, but also in Muslim-governed societies with their own legal structures, expectations, and limits. At the same time, it would be misleading to romanticize this world as if it were free of hierarchy or discrimination. Jews, like other non-Muslim communities, often lived with restrictions and a subordinate legal status. Their security could vary greatly depending on the ruler, the region, and the moment in time. So the real story is mixed. Compared with some of the harsher episodes of medieval Christian Europe, certain periods under Islamic rule could look more stable or more accommodating. But that does not mean equality in the modern sense. What it does mean is that Jewish history in the Islamic world was marked by both opportunity and vulnerability, coexistence and limitation. And that complexity matters, because once again the Jewish story cannot be reduced to one experience in one place. It is a global history of adaptation under many different kinds of power. By the 19th century, a new force was reshaping Europe, and with it, the political meaning of identity itself. That force was nationalism. Before this, many empires ruled over mixed populations with layered loyalties, local customs, dynasties, and religious communities all existing inside larger imperial frameworks. But nationalism introduced a more intense idea, the idea that a people defined by shared language, ancestry, culture, or history ought to see itself as a nation and, ideally, to have political expression as one. That shift mattered enormously for Jews in Europe. On one hand, modern life in some places opened doors. Legal reforms and emancipation allowed many Jews greater participation in public life than they had known in earlier centuries. Some entered universities, professions, business, journalism, and politics. But nationalism also raised a disturbing question. If modern states increasingly imagined themselves as the homeland of a particular national people, where exactly did Jews fit? Could they be fully included as citizens of those nations, or would they always be treated as something separate, tolerated only conditionally? That tension ran deep. Some Jews believed integration was possible and desirable. Others saw that even as legal barriers fell, social suspicion and ethnic nationalism often remained. In other words, modernity did not simply solve the old problem. It changed its form. Instead of being excluded only on overtly religious grounds, Jews could now be cast as outsiders within a world increasingly obsessed with nationhood, mass politics, and collective identity. So this slide marks a major transition. The old world of empire and scattered minority communities was giving way to a modern world asking sharper questions about who belonged, who ruled, and what counted as a nation. Out of that modern nationalist climate emerged one of the most important and controversial movements in modern Jewish history, Zionism. At its core, Zionism was the argument that Jews were not only a religious community scattered among other nations, but a people with a historic connection to a land and therefore a legitimate claim to national restoration. That idea did not appear in a vacuum. It grew in response to the pressures of modern Europe, where many Jews had hoped emancipation and integration would finally make them secure, only to find that prejudice, exclusion, and political hostility could still return in new forms. For some Jewish thinkers, the lesson was becoming harder to ignore. If other peoples were asserting national rights, and if Jews continued to be treated as outsiders even when they assimilated, then perhaps Jewish survival required more than tolerance inside someone else's state. Perhaps it required a homeland of their own. The figure most commonly associated with political Zionism is Theodor Herzl, who argued that the Jewish question in Europe was not going to be solved simply through goodwill or gradual acceptance. His vision helped turn scattered hopes and older religious longings into a modern political movement. But it is important to note that Zionism was never a simple or universally accepted idea, even among Jews. Some embraced it as necessary and urgent. Others opposed it for religious reasons, political reasons, or because they believed Jewish life could and should continue in the diaspora. So from the beginning, Zionism was both a response to vulnerability and a debate about identity, belonging, and the future. It asked a deeply modern question with ancient roots: what does a people do when memory, insecurity, and nationalism all converge at the same moment? Once Zionism began to take clearer political form, it did not remain just an idea discussed in books, congresses, or intellectual circles. It began to take shape on the ground through migration. This early Jewish migration to Palestine is often described with the Hebrew word aliyah, meaning ascent, and it refers to the waves of Jews who moved to the land in the modern period and began building new communities there. Some came driven by conviction, believing they were participating in a historic return. Others came out of fear, fleeing persecution, instability, or exclusion elsewhere. Often, it was both at once. What matters here is that Zionism started becoming physical reality through settlement, agriculture, institutions, and local presence. Land was purchased, farming communities were established, and new social experiments began to emerge. For many of those involved, this was not merely relocation. It was nation-building before a nation formally existed. At the same time, this process was never happening in an empty land, and that is one of the reasons it would become so contested. Palestine was already home to an existing population, largely Arab, living under Ottoman rule. So early Jewish migration carried both aspiration and tension from the start. For Zionist settlers, this could be seen as return and renewal. For many local Arabs, it increasingly raised fears about demographic change, land, and political displacement. So this slide is about beginnings, but not simple beginnings. It is about an idea becoming settlement, memory becoming movement, and a national project taking root in a land where other people were also deeply rooted. Before the First World War, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, and understanding that setting matters because later arguments often flatten the picture into something much simpler than it really was. Ottoman Palestine was not a modern nation-state with fixed political categories the way people often imagine borders today. It was a region within a much larger imperial system, and its population was diverse, layered, and locally rooted. The majority of the population was Arabic-speaking and largely Muslim, with Christian Arab communities as well, while Jewish communities were also present, especially in places with deep religious significance like Jerusalem. Some of those Jewish communities had been there continuously for a very long time, while others had arrived more recently. So even before the massive controversies of the 20th century, this was already a land with overlapping attachments, sacred geography, and mixed populations. That point is important because it pushes back against simplistic slogans from every direction. It was neither an empty land waiting for history to begin, nor a place untouched by long-standing Jewish connection. It was a lived-in region under imperial rule, populated by communities with different identities, memories, and expectations. And because it was governed by the Ottomans, local life was also shaped by imperial administration rather than by modern nationalist sovereignty. That meant many of the categories that later became explosive were still developing. So this slide sets the stage for the next phase of the story by showing that before the First World War, Palestine was already a real society with its own people and complexities, but it was also a place where older religious ties, newer migration, and imperial decline were starting to converge in ways that would become increasingly difficult to manage. In 1917, in the middle of the First World War, the British government issued what became known as the Balfour Declaration, a short statement with enormous historical consequences. In that declaration, Britain expressed support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. On the surface, the wording may sound careful and diplomatic, but in practice it opened the door to a political transformation whose implications were far bigger than the sentence itself. Why did Britain do this? Part of the answer lies in wartime strategy, imperial calculation, and the habit great powers have of making promises in regions they do not yet fully control, especially when they believe those promises may serve larger geopolitical interests. And that is one of the most important things to understand here. The declaration was not issued in a vacuum of idealism. It emerged from a world of collapsing empires, wartime bargaining, and British ambitions in the Middle East. But the controversy begins immediately, because while the declaration supported a Jewish national home, Palestine was already inhabited by an Arab majority population whose own political future was very much at stake. So from the start, many Arabs saw the declaration as a profound act of disregard, a moment when an outside empire appeared to endorse a major national project in someone else's land without genuine consent from the people living there. For Zionists, the declaration was a breakthrough, a form of international recognition for aspirations that had long seemed uncertain. For many Palestinian Arabs, it looked like the first major diplomatic step toward dispossession. That is why this document matters so much. It was brief, but it helped turn a developing conflict into an international one, tying Jewish hopes, Arab fears, and British imperial policy into the same increasingly unstable framework. From the Arab perspective, the Balfour Declaration and the growing Zionist project were not abstract diplomatic developments. They were signs that the political future of their own land might be decided over their heads. That is the core of Arab opposition in this period. Palestinian Arabs were not simply reacting to one document in isolation. They were responding to the growing fear that a movement backed by outside powers, rising migration, and international recognition could eventually transform them from the local majority into a politically threatened population in their own homeland. And from their point of view, that fear was not irrational. If one community is building national institutions, purchasing land, increasing migration, and winning support from a major empire, the other community is going to start asking a very basic question: where does this leave us? That question drove a great deal of the resistance that followed. Arab opposition took different forms, from political organizing and petitions to protest and, at times, violent confrontation. Some opposed Zionism because they saw it as a direct threat to Arab national rights. Others saw British policy itself as the deeper betrayal, because Britain had positioned itself as ruler while appearing to favor one national project over another. So this slide is important because it reminds us that the conflict was not born only from competing myths or ancient hatred. It was also rooted in concrete political fears about land, power, representation, and the future. For many Palestinian Arabs, opposition was not just about rejecting someone else's dream. It was about trying to prevent their own dispossession before it became irreversible. As the years went on, opposition hardened into a much broader cycle of unrest, and this is where the conflict began to take on a more dangerous and entrenched form. It was no longer only about declarations, petitions, or competing political arguments. Violence was becoming part of the landscape. Riots broke out, mistrust deepened, and armed groups began to play a larger role. This is often what happens when two national movements believe the same land is essential to their future and neither trusts the political system managing the dispute. Under British rule, that mistrust only grew worse, because the British were trying to administer a deeply unstable situation while also carrying the burden of their own contradictory promises and imperial interests. Jewish militias emerged in part from the desire for self-defense and community protection, especially as violence increased. At the same time, Arab resistance also intensified, driven by fear, anger, and the belief that time was working against them. Once that cycle begins, every clash becomes more than a local event. Each side starts reading present violence through the memory of past grievances and the expectation of future threats. That creates a brutal feedback loop. One community arms because it feels unsafe. The other sees those arms as proof of hostile intent. One act of violence confirms the fears of the next. And with each round, moderate voices lose ground to harder ones. So this slide marks a major escalation. The conflict is no longer just a contest of ideas or diplomatic claims. It is becoming militarized, communal, and much harder to reverse, because trust, once broken at this scale, is one of the hardest things in history to rebuild. The Holocaust stands as one of the greatest crimes in human history and one of the darkest turning points in Jewish history in particular. During the rule of Nazi Germany, 6 million Jews were systematically murdered in a campaign of persecution and extermination that aimed not merely to oppress Jews, but to erase them from Europe altogether. This was not a random outbreak of wartime brutality. It was organized, ideological, bureaucratic mass murder. That distinction matters, because the Holocaust showed how a modern state could use administration, propaganda, transportation systems, record-keeping, and industrial methods to carry out destruction on a scale that earlier generations could hardly have imagined. For Jewish communities, the impact was devastating beyond words. Entire families, towns, institutions, and centuries-old centers of Jewish life were wiped out. But the Holocaust also changed the political meaning of Jewish survival in the modern world. For many Jews, and for many outside observers as well, it shattered any lingering belief that life in Europe could simply return to normal with better intentions or better laws alone. The old hope that Jewish vulnerability could be solved through gradual acceptance now seemed dangerously inadequate. If a people could be so fully integrated into European society in some places and still be targeted for extermination, then the argument for a secure Jewish homeland took on new force. That does not mean the Holocaust created Zionism, because Zionism long predated it, but it undeniably transformed the urgency around it. After the Holocaust, the question of Jewish statehood no longer looked to many people like a distant ideological project. It looked like a matter of survival, refuge, and the need for a place where Jews would not depend entirely on the goodwill of others for their physical security. In 1947, the newly formed United Nations proposed a partition plan for Palestine, and with that proposal, the conflict entered a new phase. The basic idea was to divide the land into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, while placing Jerusalem under a special international arrangement because of its unique religious significance. On paper, partition may sound like a practical compromise, the kind of political solution people often reach when two national movements claim the same territory. But in reality, it was anything but simple. Jewish leaders, though not without reservations, generally accepted the plan because it offered international recognition and a path to statehood. For many Zionists, this was a historic opportunity, imperfect but real. Arab leaders, on the other hand, rejected it. From their perspective, the plan was profoundly unjust. The Arab population was still the majority in the land as a whole, and yet the proposal would give a large share of territory to the Jewish state. To many Arabs, this looked less like compromise and more like an outside body endorsing the division of their homeland without their consent. So the same plan was understood in radically different ways. To one side, it was legitimacy and long-delayed recognition. To the other, it was dispossession dressed up as diplomacy. And that is what makes this slide so important. The partition plan did not merely fail to resolve the conflict. It exposed how far apart the two national visions had become. Each side was no longer arguing only about borders. Each was arguing about justice, legitimacy, and whether the international system had any right to decide such a question at all. On May 14, 1948, Jewish leaders declared the establishment of the State of Israel, and with that declaration, a political project that had developed over decades became a sovereign state. For many Jews, this was a moment of extraordinary historic significance, not simply because a new country had been founded, but because it was understood as the re-establishment of Jewish political independence in a land bound to Jewish memory for millennia. After centuries of diaspora, persecution, exclusion, and, most recently, the catastrophe of the Holocaust, the declaration carried immense emotional force. It represented refuge, self-determination, and the belief that Jews would no longer remain permanently dependent on the decisions of outside rulers for collective survival. But at the very same moment, for many Palestinian Arabs, this declaration signaled something very different. It meant that the national project they feared was now becoming a state, and that the balance of power in the land was shifting in a way they believed threatened their own future. That is why this moment is so historically powerful and so contested. It is remembered by one people as independence and by another as the opening of disaster. And both of those memories are tied to real historical experience. The declaration itself did not settle the conflict. It crystallized it. It turned decades of migration, diplomacy, fear, and confrontation into a new political reality that would immediately be tested by war. So this slide marks a moment of arrival, but not of peace. It is the point at which aspiration became statehood, and statehood became the center of one of the most enduring conflicts of the modern era. The declaration of Israeli independence was followed almost immediately by war, and that war would shape the region for generations. What began as a struggle over the end of the British Mandate and the future of Palestine quickly became a broader regional conflict as neighboring Arab states entered the fighting. For the new state of Israel, this was a war of survival at the very moment of birth. For Arab governments and many Palestinians, it was a war against the consolidation of a state they saw as illegitimate and threatening. And for the people caught inside the land itself, it was a moment when political conflict turned fully into military reality. Wars like this are never only about battlefield lines. They are about institutions, logistics, morale, leadership, and the ability to turn a declaration into an actual functioning state under fire. Israel managed to survive and, by the end of the war, held more territory than had been envisioned in the United Nations partition plan. That result mattered enormously, because it meant the map was no longer being shaped mainly by diplomatic proposals. It was being shaped by force, victory, collapse, and whatever each side could actually hold. For Arab states, the outcome was a major setback. For Palestinians, the war was even more devastating, because while governments could regroup after military defeat, many ordinary people lost homes, communities, and any sense that the political order around them would protect their place in the land. So this war was not just the first Arab-Israeli war. It was the violent birth of a new regional reality, one in which statehood, borders, and national memory would all be forged through conflict rather than consensus. The Palestinian term for what happened in this period is the Nakba, meaning catastrophe, and that word captures how deeply this moment is remembered in Palestinian history. During the war surrounding the creation of Israel, a large number of Palestinians were displaced from their homes, towns, and villages, and many never returned. That much is not really in dispute. The deeper controversy is over how and why this happened. Some argue that many Palestinians fled because of the chaos of war, fear, and calls from Arab leaders or local conditions that made civilian life impossible. Others argue that expulsions were carried out directly in many cases and that displacement was not simply an accidental byproduct of war, but part of the process by which a new state secured territory and demographic control. In reality, historians often point to a mixture of causes that varied from place to place. And that is important because this was not one single event unfolding in one identical way everywhere. But whatever combination of flight, fear, coercion, or expulsion took place in different locations, the result was enormous and lasting. A great many Palestinians became refugees, and that refugee question did not fade away after the war ended. It became one of the central unresolved issues of the entire conflict. This is why the Nakba remains so central to Palestinian identity and memory. For Israelis, 1948 is often remembered above all as independence and survival. For Palestinians, it is remembered as dispossession, rupture, and the beginning of life in exile or under permanent uncertainty. And if you want to understand why the conflict remains so emotionally charged, you have to understand that these two foundational memories were born in the same war, on the same land, at the same time. In 1967, the Six-Day War dramatically changed the map and the political future of the conflict. In a matter of days, Israel fought neighboring Arab states and emerged with control over major territories, including East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. The speed of the victory shocked much of the world, but its deeper significance lay in what came after. This was not just another war added to a long regional timeline. It transformed the conflict by placing large Palestinian populations and highly sensitive territories under Israeli control. It also changed the symbolic landscape, especially because East Jerusalem, with its enormous religious and historical importance, was now in Israeli hands. For many Israelis, the war was seen as a stunning military success and, in some ways, as a moment of national survival in a hostile environment. For many Arabs, it was a humiliating defeat that exposed the weakness of surrounding states and deepened the crisis of Palestinian dispossession. And for Palestinians, it meant that the struggle was entering a new phase, one defined not only by the memory of 1948, but by direct occupation, territorial control, and the daily reality of living under a transformed political order. This is also where later controversies over settlements, borders, sovereignty, and the future of Jerusalem become much harder to separate from the war itself. Once territory changes hands in war, the question is never only who won. The question becomes what will be built, governed, claimed, or resisted afterward. That is why the Six-Day War remains one of the most important turning points in the entire history of Israel and the Palestinian question. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War showed that the shock of 1967 had not settled the region into stability at all. Instead, it revealed how unfinished and volatile everything still was. Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, and the timing alone gave the war enormous psychological force. For Israel, the attack was a reminder that military victory in one war does not remove danger in the next. For Arab states, especially Egypt, the war was in part an attempt to challenge the post-1967 reality and recover lost ground, but it was also about restoring dignity after a humiliating defeat. That matters, because states do not act only for territory. They also act for credibility, deterrence, domestic legitimacy, and regional standing. The war itself was costly and intense, and although Israel ultimately recovered militarily, the conflict shattered the sense of invulnerability that had followed the Six-Day War. It also changed the political atmosphere. A war can produce exhaustion as well as escalation, and in this case the conflict helped open the way for later diplomatic shifts, especially the realization that endless military confrontation carried enormous risks for everyone involved. So the Yom Kippur War is important not just because of what happened on the battlefield, but because of what it exposed. It showed that the conflict could still erupt suddenly, that prior victories had not resolved the deeper issues, and that military success alone could not create a stable political future for the region. By this point, the conflict can no longer be understood simply as a series of wars between states. It has become centered on what is often called the Palestinian question, meaning the unresolved issue of Palestinian political existence, national rights, and future status. At the heart of that question are three deeply contested issues: land, sovereignty, and security. Land matters because both Israelis and Palestinians see the same territory as central to their history, identity, and future. Sovereignty matters because without real political authority, promises of peace can sound empty, while with competing claims to authority, every border becomes a flashpoint. And security matters because both sides carry deep historical fears. Israelis often see security through the lens of survival in a region marked by war, attack, and vulnerability. Palestinians often see security through the lens of occupation, dispossession, statelessness, and the daily uncertainty of living without full control over their own political future. That is what makes this issue so difficult. Each side tends to experience itself as reacting to danger, while the other side sees those reactions as part of the danger itself. Measures taken in the name of protection can be experienced by the other side as domination. Demands for self-determination can be interpreted by the other side as existential threat. And once a conflict reaches that stage, facts on the ground begin to harden. Settlements, checkpoints, borders, armed groups, walls, and competing institutions all become part of the lived reality. So the Palestinian question is not just one issue within the conflict. It is the core of the modern conflict, because it asks whether two peoples with overlapping claims, deep grievances, and profound fears can find any framework in which both political existence and human security are taken seriously at the same time. One reason this history remains so difficult to discuss is that there is no single narrative that everyone accepts. Instead, there are competing narratives, and each one is shaped not only by facts, but by memory, identity, trauma, and moral emphasis. The same event can appear entirely different depending on where someone stands within the story. The founding of Israel can be told as a story of national return, refuge, and survival after centuries of exile and persecution. The very same moment can also be told as a story of dispossession, displacement, and the loss of a homeland for Palestinians. The destruction of Jerusalem in the ancient world can be remembered as catastrophe and endurance. Modern wars can be remembered as self-defense on one side and domination on the other. And this is not always because one side knows history and the other does not. Very often, it is because historical events are being filtered through different collective experiences that give different weight to suffering, legitimacy, and justice. That does not mean every claim made in the name of history is equally accurate, and it does not mean facts do not matter. They matter enormously. But facts alone do not settle stories when those stories have become part of a people's identity. Once history becomes sacred memory, national memory, or inherited trauma, arguments about the past are also arguments about who belongs, who was wronged, and what is owed in the present. That is why this subject generates so much heat. People are not only debating dates and events, they are debating moral meaning. And unless we understand that, we will miss why this history is never just academic. It is lived history, argued history, and remembered history all at once. When you step back from all the wars, exiles, empires, destructions, migrations, and debates, one fact stands out above all the rest: Jewish identity endured. That is what makes this history so remarkable. Across roughly 3,000 years, the Jewish people survived the fall of kingdoms, the destruction of both temples, long centuries of diaspora, repeated persecution, forced expulsions, and some of the worst violence in human history, yet they did not disappear. That kind of continuity is rare. Many ancient peoples were absorbed into larger civilizations once their political centers collapsed. The Jews were not. And the reason is not mysterious if we pay attention to the pattern we have seen throughout this story. Jewish continuity did not depend only on armies, borders, or kings. Again and again, it was preserved through memory, law, ritual, text, family, community, and the ability to adapt without fully dissolving into the surrounding world. That balance is incredibly hard to sustain. Change too little, and a people may break under pressure. Change too much, and it may lose itself. Jewish history shows a repeated ability to do both at once, to preserve a core identity while surviving in radically different circumstances. That is why this slide matters so much. It reminds us that this story is not only about suffering or conflict. It is also about endurance. Through exile, empire, and persecution, there remained a sense of peoplehood strong enough to carry the past into the future. And without that continuity, none of the later chapters in this history would make sense at all. And that is why this story does not really end. The history of Judaism and Israel is still unfolding right now, in real time, in politics, in religion, in identity, in conflict, and in memory. What began in the ancient world as the story of a small people in a contested land became one of the longest and most consequential historical arcs on Earth, and it still shapes how millions of people understand themselves and the world around them. That is part of what makes this history so powerful. It is not sealed off in museums or buried in ruins alone. It lives on in prayers, in borders, in arguments over justice, in family stories, in sacred texts, and in competing visions of what the land means and who it belongs to. And the deeper truth is that this history resists easy simplification. It contains survival and suffering, return and displacement, faith and politics, continuity and rupture, all layered on top of one another across centuries. If we are going to study it honestly, we have to be willing to sit with that complexity rather than flatten it into slogans. If you made it all the way through this video, thank you for being here. If you found it valuable, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History for more long-form documentaries that dig beneath the surface of the past. And before you go, here is the question I want to leave you with. When you look at this long history, what part of the story do you think people today most often misunderstand?